Spring is in the air, and welcome to the Everyday Rose Show. Roses are budding up, and boy, this is a great time of year. In this episode, we're going to talk to Georgia Clay. She's a new plants manager at Monrovia Nursery. We're going to talk about a couple new lines of roses and a wonderful, boldly colored line of echinacea, or coneflower, and how to use them in the garden. We're also going to learn why hollow sticks in the fall mean less aphids in the spring. And lastly, my 20-year-old beloved Rev Door gives me a great surprise. Welcome to the show. Monrovia Nursery has been around for a long time, close to 100 years as a matter of fact. Released just thousands of beautiful plants, including roses, and they're developing a couple of really new lines of roses, which I think are really interesting, fun for the landscape, disease-resistant and things like that. Much like this rose here, La Rose du Molinard from Delbard. Wonderful, wonderful rose. So Georgia Clay is a new plants manager at Monrovia Nursery, so let's go inside and meet Georgia.
Georgia, it is so nice to get to talk to you a little bit. We obviously had some conversation during pre-production, but welcome to the Everyday Rose Show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, we're excited to hear about the stuff that Monrovia is doing. I know you've got some great rose lines, and you've got an echinacea line that I adore because they go great with roses, and we'll talk about those. And then we're going to talk about something that I know is very, very dear to your heart, which is bold colors in the garden, which most people are terrified of.
Which they should not be.
I totally agree. And what's neat is that both of your rose collections and the echinacea collection are very vibrant colors. And so I think that's going to be exciting for people to learn how to use this. I think most people with rose gardens, they think of pastels and the soft English kind of colors. Well, particularly if you live in a climate with a warm, hot sun, those get washed out. So, but I digress. We'll get to that in a moment. So first of all, you're in charge of new plants at Monrovia Nursery, and Monrovia has obviously been around for, 80 years, 90 years, almost 100. I think you guys are getting close to 100 years, bringing wonderful new plants. And I think every gardener is probably so jealous of your job because we all love to go out and look for the new and latest and greatest plants, and you actually get paid to do it. So just tell us a little bit about what your role is at Monrovia.
Yeah, so, you're right. It's a fantastic job. So awesome. So my job, I'm the new plant manager. And what that means is I just manage the trial system throughout Monrovia. We have 4 nurseries, so scattered throughout the country, coast to coast. And so we trial at all 4 of those nurseries, and I manage those trials. I work with the breeders to bring them in, to look for the new stuff that's out there, and just be sure that we're getting a good look at things for a while before we bring them to the market. Yeah,
so obviously you work with breeders that when breeders find you. I'm assuming that's kind of how the relationship generally works in a situation like that. And I think what a lot of customers and gardeners don't understand completely is the trial system. I think they know there's some testing going on, but I don't think they realize just how rigorous it is. So you mentioned you have 4 nurseries where you trial at. So that obviously, I'm assuming, gives you regionality. So maybe walk us through. So a new plant shows up, either you find it or a breeder finds you. It shows up, and then kind of walk us through how it eventually gets to market. How long does that take, and what's the testing like?
Yeah, so it depends on obviously the type. Roses, since we're talking about roses, that takes years. And oftentimes we'll start with a really large batch of roses. So we have hundreds of varieties. And we're super lucky because at our 4 nurseries, we kind of cover the gamut of regionality. So we have Cairo, Georgia, which is super south, so really hot, really humid, black spot city, just tons of disease pressure there. We have Visalia, which is hot and dry, that's in California. And then obviously Oregon, where I am, more mid-range, Mediterranean climate, and then cooler, so in the Northeast and Connecticut. So we're able to run these hundreds of roses through the gamut in all these different environments and really test them for years against what's currently on the market. So we have our varieties we're already growing to sort of determine how they stand up. We're looking for, we don't treat them very nicely. They're not on any sort of spray program. We don't deadhead. We just want to see how they naturally perform. And we're pretty brutal about it. It has to be really stand out in a group of hundreds of roses. And these are already the roses that have stood out to breeders for years. They've stood out already. And so we've got the best of the best, and we're roguing them out like crazy. And from hundreds of varieties, we choose a series like Grace and Grit, and there's only 5 colors.
Yeah, I've been involved with some of the trials. I ran the Biltmore International Rose Trials when it was going on. We were a sustainable no spray trial, and I've been involved with other nurseries that done trials. And like you say, it's hundreds, if not thousands, of varieties that are trialed, and maybe 4 or 5 get to market out of that group. And so I think it's nice for people to know that Monrovia and other nurseries like Monrovia, and I love the fact that you do no spray. I think that's real important. And you're hard on them, and that's what you want to be. You want to treat them badly is what you really want to do, because that's how you find the best of the best and the cream of the crop that eventually comes to market.
Well, totally. And the reality is that most people, these are going to gardeners, and they're going to the homes of people who they don't have the time to put a lot of input into their roses, and they just want a beautiful rose. They want something that's going to perform well for them without that input. So if we can, if we were babying these roses and really taking, my job 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, really babying these, it wouldn't come close to the actuality, the reality of what will happen once they leave our nursery. So it boils down to wanting people to be successful, wanting people to not be afraid of roses. Roses are easy. They can be, at least, and they're beautiful. And we just want people to be successful. So we are really hard on them. Yes, for sure.
Yeah, and that's the best way. And like you said, you want people to be successful. And roses are the one plant that tends to intimidate people quite a bit. And I think a lot of that's due to a lot of the roses in the 70s and the 80s and even into the 90s were not treated badly when they were being trialed, to be quite honest with you. They were almost coddled a little bit and spoiled. And that's how roses got that reputation of being fussy. And, Knockout certainly changed the conversation in the United States when Bill Radler and Conrad Pilestar Roses released that one. But you guys are right in here, like you said, with the nitty gritty roses and the Grace and Grit roses that are coming out. And these are roses for the general gardener, used with plants, used in borders, used in all kinds of different ways. And I think that's what's exciting for the way roses are going, particularly here in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, they're not only tough, so, plant them, sort of forget them, but, people are also breeding moved up. And so we've got awesome colors, a ton of flower power. Things are just, you'll get a large amount of flowers over a long season on a shrub that you don't have to worry about. And there's room for those old, classic, beautiful roses. But for somebody just looking for something beautiful for their garden, there are so many options now. And I'm really happy with what we've brought to the table with Grace and Grit and Nitty Gritty. I think they're perfect for the everyday homeowner, landscaper, gardener. People will be really successful with them, which is always great.
Yeah, and that's nice because you kind of set up these 2 collections nicely here. You told us, the characteristics you're looking for. Obviously, disease resistance is going to be one of those. You mentioned you don't deadhead. That's called self-cleaning, where the rose drops the flowers on its own cleanly. I also read in the literature these are all on root, which I love because to me, rose that can't grow on its own root shouldn't be introduced into the market, because that's the definition of a vigorous rose, is one that can be grown on roots. So I love the fact that you're doing them on root as well.
Yeah, well, and what I noticed with own root roses is that in the landscape, they are a fuller, bushier rose. You get everything that's coming from the base is true to type. So you don't have that awkward, random red rose that's coming out. It's all going to be true to type. So everything that you get is the same. So you get this really nice rose. It lends itself to not looking spindly on the bottom as much as some of the other ones do. And also, if you get a hard frost or something and your roses die to the ground, what comes back is true to type. So own root roses, it sounds, kind of boring, but it's really a big deal.
Yeah, you're preaching to the choir here. I've been advocating for own root roses for over 2 decades for the exact reason you talk about. You get a much fuller bush. You might have 3 or 4 canes on a grafted rose. I've got on root roses that have got like 15, 20 canes. And what that gives you an attractive plant, whether it's in flower or not. which to me is one of the definitions of a garden rose. It's got to look like a nice, attractive plant, even without flowers on it. And some of the ones that are budded, you said they get a little bit more spindly, and you want to kind of like plant stuff at the bottom to hide the bottom half of the plant. So I think now it's going to be fun to sort of get into these roses that you sort of, introduced and hinted at with the trial system you've got. So one collection is the Grace and Grit collection. Like we mentioned, own root, self-cleaning, disease-resistant, zones 4 through 9, which is a wonderfully long range. So give us some general characteristics, some landscape use, and then why don't you introduce us to the roses that are in this collection?
Yeah, so the Grace and Grit is a fantastic shrub rose collection. They are a great size, going to be about 5 feet tall in the garden by 4 feet wide. So I personally love them in the back of a mixed border with perennials, maybe some evergreen shrubs as well for a little contrast. Another cool way that people use shrub roses, and Grace and Grit would be perfect for, is a hedge. So if you wanted to plant them in groupings, maybe 3 feet apart or so for a hedge, they look fantastic like that. The colors on these, we chose them for super saturation. So they are really high intensity. Like you mentioned, flowers that are pastel can sometimes look a little washed out. And we didn't like that look. So we really chose those vibrant, punchy colors. Just really fantastic all around roses.
Yeah, I saw the collection. They were wonderful. And like you said, you mentioned back of the border, potentially with evergreens, shrubs to give some contrast. And the contrast is such an important word in any kind of garden. And contrast is not just color. Contrast is flowers, is foliage shape, foliage color, growth habit, spiky, rounded. I mean, those where your contrast come from. And hedges, absolutely. I mean, these kind of roses do so well for hedges because you get the beauty of a hedge with the flower. And I always tell people with hedges, the best thing to do is plant actually 2 rows and then stagger the rows like this, like you said, 3 feet apart. And then you get a really nice dense hedge, and don't be afraid to let them grow into each other because these roses are disease resistant. That whole thing of air circulation doesn't really apply to those. You don't want them so dense to do this, but they should touch each other. You should not see the ground in these roses.
Yeah, and it makes it all the better. And you're right, with the disease resistance, that used to be a thing, and people were afraid of companion planting. Like, oh, I can't put my perennials too close to my roses. They need air circulation. And that might be true for some, but these new genetics that are coming out into the market with Grace and Grit, that's really not the case. You can really plan up, and don't be afraid to plant them, like you mentioned, closer. So my rule of thumb, and maybe yours is different, but I see 4 feet wide and I think, okay, I can plant them maybe 3 feet, 2.5 feet apart. That way they're just kind of blending together.
No, that's my rule of thumb as well. I mean, I totally agree. I mean, my role in my garden is I don't want to see the mulch. It's there. I don't want to see it. And if they're spaced so far apart, then that's a mulch garden, not a flower garden. And putting perennials in is we're also learning more and more when it comes to, and we'll talk about this when we come to the echinaceas, the beneficial insect that you get when you put in perennials, because that's what brings them into your garden and makes them stay. That's why that mix of perennials and roses and all kinds of other plants creates what I call a host environment for beneficial insects. And that is, it's the reason I don't have to spray chemicals in my garden. My garden's organic. There's absolutely no chemicals in this garden with 300 roses and probably 800 perennials.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, put a little echinacea, some salvia, whatever you want in there, and bring the insects in. Take the load off. Let them do the work.
Exactly. Yeah. That's why nature put them on the ground, on the earth in the first place. That's the perfect thing. So, well, why don't you take us through the Grace and Grit collection? I know there's 4 or 5, I think, in the collection. So why don't you walk us through what they are and just kind of give your impressions of each one?
Yeah. So first up, I'll just talk about Grace and Grit Yellow. This is personally one of my favorites. I love yellows in the garden. And this is a really lovely, it's not a gold yellow. It's more of a buttery, bright but soft yellow. It's really nice. And what I love is the bud color is really saturated too. So you get this lovely, beautiful, bright yellow bud. And yellows tend to fade into white a little bit as they age, but this one doesn't fade quite so much. So you still get a lovely, almost pale, soft yellow as it ages. It's really beautiful. And then we also have Grace and Grit Bicolor, which is a bicolor pink and white. This is, again, just a beautiful flower color, super saturated pinks. And as you get closer to the center, you get more white. So Really lovely. I love pairing these pink and whites with blues. So something like a hardy geranium looks really fantastic with these, with this Grace and Grit bicolor in particular. We also have just a regular pink rose, super hot pink. So really saturated again, hot pink rose. I love the foliage on these too, because the hot pink, for example, has a great red new growth. So you get a lot of interest, even before you see the flowers, you get that beautiful, rich, warm tone with the foliage. And then we also have a beautiful bright red flower. So true red, think fire engine red. That's what this is. It is super nice, really saturated. And again, that red foliage on the new growth, and then around the foliage itself, it kind of edged in red as well. So really lovely. And again, all these are going to be about the same height, so 5 feet tall or so. Fully double floribunda style flower.
Yeah, they're really beautiful. And like you said, the colors are strong, even among the pinks, which I like, actually. There's a real nice statement being made with that. And I like the fact you mentioned the new foliage being red. I'm glad that you're looking for that characteristic as well, because that can add a really nice feel and look to the roses when you've got this burgundy foliage coming up with these flowers. And then you've got so much going on because of that kind of a thing. And one little tip for people to understand is, a lot of times I get a lot of photographs and people in my Facebook group, they see this burgundy red foliage and they think it's, oh my gosh, I've got rosette disease. No, burgundy red foliage on a rose is normal. Almost many roses produce new foliage like that. So don't assume that's rosette disease. And if you're not sure, certainly post it to a Facebook group or something like that and ask the question. So this is a wonderful, outstanding group of roses, great colors, like you say, the self-cleaning, all the aspects that go with that. I think this is a really very useful group of roses.
Yeah,
so the
well,
next group,
we mentioned that, we mentioned that, disease resistance, and these have been so clean. So we put them through if anything can survive with very little black spot in Cairo, Georgia, you are doing very good. So,
yeah,
no
you
worries.
are. I'm in the upstate of South Carolina, and I know black spot very well. And I know Georgia even has more disease pressure. And so, yeah, that's an indicator. If it can survive down there with no spraying and still stay clean, then holy moly, that's going to be a great rose. But you're also, like you said, you're testing it in Visalia, California, which is extreme dry heat. So you've got that nice testing contrast going on with this group of roses. And the next group, I know the nitty gritty roses are going to be the same. I know these are a little bit shorter. So tell us a little bit about maybe just 2 or 3 of the general points about the nitty gritties, and then let's go meet the nitty gritties.
Yeah, so the nitty gritties, similar characteristics of the Grace and Grit. So they're going to be on their own root, like we had talked about. They're super clean again, reblooming, self-cleaning, all of those general characteristics that are a must-have for us when we introduce a rose. But this nitty gritty is more of a sprawling type, so more of a ground cover. It's going to be about 3 feet tall in the garden and then 4 feet wide. So really nice, a little bit shorter, but again, great for mass planting. I love these more sprawling types in large groups. I just think they look fantastic that way. They're also going to have really glossy, super shiny foliage. I feel like it's almost like somebody sprayed Pledge on the leaves.
That's a nice analogy. I like that one.
Yeah, really nice. And I would think that these they're more of a spray type rose, so less of a single floribunda type and more of a spray rose style.
Yeah, and I agree with you with these. These need to be planted in drifts. You don't want to plant one. You want to plant at least 3 together. If they're 4 feet wide, again, maybe go 3 feet apart. Let them grow into each other and touch each other. That's how they look really nice. And I'm a big fan. There's a Dutch garden designer named Piet Oudolf. I don't know if you're familiar with him or not at all. He does what's called the prairie style, which is massive drifts of perennials and grasses and things along those lines. It's a really beautiful kind of look. I've never seen him use roses in this. And I looked at this series of roses and I went, they would lend themselves well to Piet Oudolf's prairie style of planting, because I could see a mass of like 6 or 7 of them and just let them grow. And I got a great tip once from a good friend of mine. He said, with these kind of roses, mass plant them and then let them grow into each other so it looks like one giant rose. You can't see where one rose starts and one rose ends.
Yeah, that's a great, and grasses, yes, look fantastic with these. I love prairie style, the sort of wild, free look. you add a couple of scabiosa or something in there, like give it some pops, maybe some allium too.
No, I totally agree. All those things. The grasses and roses, people don't think about using them, but they actually work well together because of again, we talked about contrast earlier in the show, and the contrast of that grass and the grasses, they're also kind of graceful when they move in the wind. You know, they've got some movement to the garden, where roses tend to be a little bit more rigid. So I think they're underused, in my opinion, in gardens in general, the grasses. So, well, this is great. So I know we've got some specific nitty gritty. So why don't you introduce us to the nitty gritty band? No pun intended.
Yeah, so starting off with peach, which I'm going to say it's my favorite again. Peach and yellows, they're my favorites. So peach is fantastic. It's really nice, almost orangey apricot color. This one is saturated, but not super bright. So not a electric orange or electric pink, but it's really lovely apricot color. Just beautiful. And actually this one, not a lot of our nitty gritties or grace and grits have a scent, but nitty gritty peach does have actually quite a nice scent as well. So if you're looking for a little extra, peach is a great one for that too. We also have nitty gritty white. So white is a fantastic, if you're a little bit shy of color and you want something a little neutral so you can put in your pops and different perennials, white's a great choice for that. And this is a smaller flower, so going to be about 2 inches across, which is the smallest of the bunch, but they do produce a ton of flowers. So more of a standard spray rose type flower on this nitty gritty white.
You mentioned the flowers being a bit smaller, and I think people have to realize that, first of all, a 2-inch flower for a spray rose like this is actually pretty large. But you don't look at it at the individual blooms. You look at the mass effect of the spray head of maybe it's a 2-inch bloom, but maybe there's 50 of them on there. Well, now all of a sudden you've got a really nice large mop of flower in there. And I think, and white, like you mentioned, I've always been taught in landscape, white's a great transition color. If you're not sure how to get from one color to another color, white's sort of your nice neutral kind of break in the garden at that point in time.
Yeah, if you want to go, I always like to use hot colors as to point out something in the landscape that's I want people to look at. So if I have like a fountain or somewhere that I want people to draw their eye towards, I'm going to use a hot color, but I don't want to use a hot color like reds, oranges, yellows everywhere. So yeah, white's a great break in that. Then you sprinkle a few whites around and it all kind of feels cohesive. So really nice.
Yeah, it does. And
sure.
like you said, you mentioned like blue geraniums. I mean, blues can really make these hot colors pop like crazy. And it works well with that. So I know we've got a couple more nitty gritties. I love the nitty gritty white. I love the peach, like you said. That's one of my favorite colors as well. That kind of color combination. So tell us about a couple more of them.
Yeah. So yellow is really interesting and really unique. It again has that beautiful burgundy red new growth. So great foliage, super glossy. But the flower is yellow. It kind of opens up and it has a sort of orange outer edge. So it's almost you get multi-tones on this, which I just love. It's really an electric, bright yellow. And then just that orange on the outside just really kicks it up a notch. So this is perfect if you're looking for a really punchy yellow, something to really make a big impact. And you can't decide between orange and yellow, just pick the nitty gritty yellow.
That's a great tip. That's easy. You heard it from Georgia, nitty gritty yellow.
Yeah, it's cool. And it's a rare, I hardly ever see that color variation. You get a lot of oranges, you get a lot of yellows, but having that kind of transition is really neat, I think, and really makes this one special.
Yeah, when I was looking at the photographs, I agree. That was the nice thing about it. The outer edge is kind of real. I also like the fact that it has it's open in the center, so the stamens are revealed, which I think is a really nice touch as well. I mean, that again. Now you've got a little bit of orange, you've got the yellow, then you've got the color from the stamens, burgundy foliage, green foliage. I mean, you've got a lot going on in one plant. When, like we said, we talk about contrast. There's one plant that kind of produces an enormous amount of contrast.
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of emphasis on petal counts in flowers and roses, and especially, and there's some beauty to double flowers where you can see the stamen. I love that look. And these aren't single by any means, but they're double, and you can still see some of that contrast that the bring and the stamens bring.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I'm actually a big fan of singles and semi-doubles. I like that kind of more wild kind of look. I got into roses initially because of a lot of the old garden roses, but even then, when you go back to the old Damax and Gallicas, which are fully petaled, but I've always liked singles. I just think There's a charm they have all their own. And again, we talk about contrast. You can have some fully double roses, some semi-double roses, some single roses. And now we've got a lot playing in the garden.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it lends itself to pairing really well with different forms if you're looking for a perennial that maybe has a more fancy, lots of petal counts.
So is there another nitty-gritty we need to meet?
Yes, there are two more. So there's Nitty Gritty Red, which again, like the Grace and Grit Red, really super vibrant, true red color. And then we also have Nitty Gritty Pink. So again, hot pink, similar color to the Grace and Grit. So would make great companions if you have room for a larger shrub rose and then more of a ground cover rose. They're similar colors. So really lovely, saturated blooms.
Yeah, I mean, these are great collections, the Grace and Grit and the Nitty Gritty collection. Like you said, for general landscaping, mass planting, I can see them in containers. I can see them as hedges. You know, you've got the Grace and Grit for the back of the border, the Nitty Gritty for probably mid border if you're doing more something traditional like that. And I would suspect, just by as you described them and as I read about them, the care of these is probably pretty minimal. I mean, obviously, you know, you can do some basic fertilizing and feeding. You want to make sure your soil's healthy. That's the most important thing in a garden, and I stress that all the time. But I would think with pruning, obviously, you know, the 3Ds, dead, diseased, and dying comes out. But I'm thinking, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm thinking just a general shaping to these is about all they're ever going to need.
Yeah, you're totally right. I mean, you can treat these roses like you would any other shrub in your garden. So I tend to prune in late winter, and you just prune to shape if need be. You know, you probably won't have to do it within the first couple of years, but you might want to do it, especially if you planted it maybe along a sidewalk or in the entryway. Just prune it to shape, and that's really it. It's not scary. You can also, some people like to prune after the first flush to encourage more flowers the second flush, and you can do that with these as well, but it's not necessary.
Yeah, they're basically just I always tell people, you know, prune by what's the rose's job in the garden. You know, if it's a back of border plant, like the Grace and Grit can be back of border, maybe prune to like 3 feet, you know, 3.5 feet, take a third off or something like that, because you don't want it to be really low. You want it to be the back of the border. If it's the Nitty Gritty collection, like you say, it's along the sidewalk, well, then maybe you prune a little harder so people don't get, you know, scratched as they're going by. But they're wonderful groups of roses. You know, again, own root, easy to care for, disease resistant, don't need a lot of pruning, obviously time tested in those various 4 climates around the country. So I think, you know, Monrovia to me is just continuing making rose growing more approachable and easier for gardeners in general who used to be terrified of roses. So I want to thank Monrovia for that.
Yeah, well, thank you. We're glad that you like these roses, and yeah, we're pretty excited about them too.
I think both of those lines of roses are going to be fantastic in any garden. I can just see them being used in all kinds of places. But when I was going through some of the new plants at Monrovia Nursery before I interviewed Georgia, my eye was caught by a new line of coneflower that they've got, or echinacea is the other term. I love echinacea in the garden. It has that upright growth habit and that sort of like cone, spiky flower petal thing that's got going on. Great contrast with roses. And we talk about contrast a lot here on the Everyday Rose Show when it comes to planting. But I also noticed this line of coneflower because of the incredibly bold color line, and that led to me some intriguing possibilities. So let's go meet this line of coneflower.
So, Georgia, I want to talk about a new collection that you guys have. Maybe it's not so new. I don't know. It's the Evolution Coneflower series. Coneflower is obviously known as echinacea as well. And I love it. I use a lot of echinacea in my garden. I love the contrast in shape. With roses, they have that upright kind of habit. They also tend to flower in the summertime when the roses, at least in the upstate of South Carolina, are a little bit more on the quiet side. So, you know, I'm going to throw some photographs of the various series that people could see of these things. The colors are wonderful, but give us some characteristics of the Evolution Coneflower series.
Yeah, so one of the main features that we are looking for the coneflower is something that's a little bit shorter, a little bit more of a mound, so you're not going to have to support it. It's not going to flop over when it has a bunch of flowers, and that's also another characteristic we're looking for is a bunch of flowers. So with the Evolution series, we're looking for something shorter. So these are going to be about 1.5 feet at maximum, 18 inches or so. And you're not going to have to support them. So, you know, you'll get the flowers and they won't be sitting in your mulch or somewhere where you can't see them. They're going to be nice and self-supporting. They're also just put on a profusion of bloom. So this is a mix between plants that we selected at our nursery and also plants from Terra Nova Nursery. And Terra Nova puts out beautiful echinacea. And so we're lucky to have some of theirs in our collection.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Terra Nova. They actually do really nice plants, and I like, like I said, I grow echinacea in my garden, but a lot of times, by the time the flowers are, boom, they're on the ground, And I love this series. What I think's neat about these, you mentioned that they're shorter, 18, 20 inches or something like that. I could see these like in a garden, repeated, not a specific variety repeated, but maybe you do the evolution colorific coneflower, then maybe you do the fiesta coneflower, and you kind of move them along, and that repetition of plant look, I guess, for lack of a better word, being a coneflower, is what then begins to pull a garden and kind of tie it together a little bit.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And one thing I love with the colorific you mentioned, it has a contrast of colors. So at one time, it can have multiple colors. So it starts out kind of yellow, salmony, and then it moves through pinks. So it does really nicely with other echinacea colors because it sort of draws all of those different colors out of that flower. So, you could put it with yellow falls, for example, and it would make that colorific, the yellow parts of that colorific really stand out. So that's something that I love to do. And I think, plant exactly like you mentioned, and you'd have a beautiful garden, especially with the roses, with the difference in shapes and the difference in habits and flowers.
Yeah, and you just mentioned a really important design tip, which is looking for the colors in the flower itself. Don't look for the dominant color necessarily. Pairing doesn't have to be, whether it's analogous colors or however you want to do it. It doesn't have to be, I have a pink flower, therefore I have to go focus on the pink. Well, maybe the stamens are yellow. Well, that could be a color that you can work with. So to have something like this coneflower that's got these variations of color, now you all of a sudden can broaden the palette of what's in the garden and what's going to work with that particular plant.
Yeah. I mean, talk about adding a yellow rose in. It would be fantastic. Yeah.
That would be an absolutely beautiful look. I love this. So a couple care tips for echinacea. Now, one thing that I like about echinacea as well is when the stems in the fall, I never cut my perennials back in the fall. The more and more I've read, the more and more you actually want to leave them, because beneficial insects, one of the things they need food, water, shelter. Shelter is rough foliage is what they call it. That's what grasses are good for. But I also recently read, and this was new to me, from a site called Savvy Gardening, that the hollow stems of things like coneflower stalks and things like that, a lot of the beneficial insects will actually burrow into that and overwinter in there. And if you cut them and throw them away, you're basically throwing away a lot of the beneficial eggs or insects that are basically hanging out to be beneficial in your gardens. That's another reason not to cut them back until spring. And if you do, and even then when you cut them back, they actually say just kind of like loosely scatter them in the beds. So if there's insects left in there, then again, those insects can emerge. So you've got a great, with this coneflower series, you've got a great plant that's beautiful, it's attractive, you've got the wonderful colors, you're going to bring in pollinators, beneficial insects. I mean, talk about a powerhouse.
Yeah, well, I think that's such an interesting point about the insects in the hollow stems. You look at your winter garden and you think, oh, everything's dead. But really, there's so much going on, and your garden is still environment for all these beneficial insects that you just, it's easy to overlook, but you have so much life still in your garden throughout the year. So it's great not to cut back your perennials for that reason. That's such a good point.
Yeah, a garden with rough foliage over the wintertime, and it's an apartment house for all kinds of beneficial insects and even some of our native bees. I mean, there's all kinds of things that need that. And the echinacea as well, if you leave the flowers, those seed heads are good for birds. I mean, it's amazing what these plants can do during the winter when you're thinking, oh, they don't look like much, but there's a lot of life that really counts on those plants in the wintertime. So that's the reason, don't cut them back at that point in time.
Yeah, totally. Bring them to the garden, keep them year round. So that's the best thing to do.
Now that we've met this bold colored line of echinacea coneflowers, how do we use them in the garden? Bold colors kind of frighten people an awful lot, much like this azalea that was here when we first bought this farm. So how do you use bold colors with your roses and your other plants? Let's find out.
So, Georgia, we've now met the Grace and Grit collection. We've met the Nitty Gritty collection. We've met the Evolution Coneflower series. Wonderful plants, easy to care for, very useful in the garden. And like we talked about at the very, very top of this segment, they have amazingly wonderful, bold colors. And we sort of teased this a little bit, that a lot of people are terrified of using bold colors. But when you and I had a pre-production meeting a couple of weeks ago, I mentioned about using bold colors, and your eyes just lit up. So I know this is something that near and dear to your heart. So take us through why people should absolutely have bold colors in their garden.
Yeah, well, I think there's a misconception about bold colors. that they're kind of gaudy or childish in some way. And that if you're going to use bold colors, it's either the whole garden in bold or nothing at all. And I just don't subscribe to that. I think bold colors have their place. So you can use them as a way to emphasize things in your garden. So if you have a focal point or something that you want to draw people's eyes towards, go with the bold colors, go with those hot colors that sort of pop out at you, and then use the more light, cool colors, maybe the greens, some foliage to turn your eyes away. So
no, those are great points. You can use the bold colors to draw your eye. If you've got maybe a piece of statuary that you were very fond of, or something along those lines, and you want people to move in that direction, I think that's a great use for that. If you go with like a traditional garden rooms type of things, where you're moving through different spaces, maybe you want to move through one room and then you want to draw someone's eye to the other room. Well, then through the opening, you can have your bold colors there. And there's a very, very well-known English garden designer, Gertrude Jekyll, who sort of invented the English cottage style, traditional English border. Was her, and William Robinson was another influencer in that. And she actually talked about, in a traditional border, she said, you do bold, hot colors in the center, and then you go more softer and pasteller as you move out. So then you've got, instead of just all, pastel colors or all hot colors, you've got your hot colors in the center, and then you move out. Again, we talked about earlier, whites are useful for that kind of thing as well. So she was a big subscriber, even in an English climate, of using the bold colors.
Yeah, well, then your eye has something to draw towards. If your eye knows where it wants to go, and it can have some relief in that. And so bold colors, you tend to think of not having any relief. But if you use those tips, you can put in those reds that you love, put in those hot yellows, and you can still find the relief elsewhere. You're just being very intentional with your boldness.
Yes, I totally agree. And so I hope that more people will try bold colors. And the thing I always talk about in landscaping to think about as well, and keep this in mind, that if something doesn't work, you can always move the plants. Plants are easily moved. So I move plants all the time. So don't be afraid to do that. So, well, Georgia, this has been great. I love that we've talked about we met some wonderful rose series. We met the Evolution Coneflower series. Obviously, Monrovia's got all kinds. We could probably do hours and hours on Monrovia's collection of plants, but you've got all kinds of wonderful things that pair with it as well. I love the testing that you're doing. So again, I want to thank you so much for joining us on this episode. And I've had a wonderful time talking to you about all things roses and coneflower and bold colors.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been so much fun. I'm sure we'll talk again.
I know we will.
I built this probably, 16, 17, 18, maybe even close to 20 years ago, and it's just falling in disrepair. It's probably past time for actually repairing and fixing this thing. But I've got several roses on this. I've got Rural England. I've got an unreleased climber from a New Zealand breeder. Rev Dor is over here. Gertrude Jekyll, New Hampshire State House for the late, great Mike Lowe, good friend, is over there as well. So I need to get these roses off the fence, secure them so I can repair and replace what needs to be done. Well, the first step is very simple. It's pruning, basically, is what it is. And basically, I've got my main canes here. You remember from the former videos, main canes are the ones that come from the base. Laterals come off the main canes. So I'm going to take all these laterals, and I'm going to cut them back hard this time. Not just like a foot or 2 foot, like almost back to 6 inches. So, I've got a butt eye here, and I've got a butt eye there. And same thing over here with this lateral over here. And that's basically what I'm going to be doing, is just continuing to take these laterals back, and then I can start to get the roses off the fence. I've gotten to a point where I just sort of want to stop for a moment and show you where I'm at. You may remember this rose, again, from the photographs you've seen or old videos that you've seen, or even from the beginning of this video, how bushy and full it was. And I'm taking it back hard. Like I said, I've cut the laterals back nice and hard. Let me see if standing in front of that helps you a little bit. You can see what I've done there. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, gosh, that rose is so much shorter now. Will it, what's going to look like? Will it bloom? Well, here's the thing. It's not shorter. It's less bulky. Because I've left the main canes. Remember our rule. Leave the main canes, cut the laterals. I've still got lots of length here. When I repair this fence, I can put it back. The other nice thing it gave me a chance to do was to get in there and get out some big old canes. These were actually sawn right down to the base. You've heard me talk about this. Remove old canes to rejuvenate and get new growth. And I'm looking excited to see that this year as well. And my old Rev Dor, my old friend on the other side, has been also kind of gotten the same treatment. Took an old cane out of it as well. And so that's where we're at. So right now, and I also just did this temporarily to secure these. just so they, don't get windy and rocking around a lot and stuff in the wind. So that's where we're at. And right now, I start rebuilding the fence and the arch. The arbor's rebuilt, the fence is back up, and I can't be more pleased. If you remember, it was 2x2s up there before. I rebuilt it with 4x4s and sort of redesigned the structure to give it a little bit more strength to it. I put the roses back on, and I was going to film myself and show you how I did that, but then pruning season got in the way. But I still want to show you a couple of little tips of exactly how I tied these roses back onto this fence, and a little of my theory behind it. So let's take a look. As I mentioned, I wanted to actually film me tying the canes on the fence, but unfortunately, pruning season did get in the way, so there we go. But what I've done with this fence is I've actually attached wire, but I've gone vertically this time. I want to try something different. Traditionally, you go horizontally with wire, maybe 3 wires, and tie them in. But I've got a vertical wire here. I've got another one right here in the middle. That's 4 feet. These are 8-foot panels. I've got another one there as well. This allows me to tie these canes at any height that I want to tie them to, as opposed to being, sort of forced to tie them along those wires that are running horizontally. So as you can see here, I've done what I'm supposed to do. I've got them all running horizontally. Remember, that's that 45-degree bloomerama zone that we've got. And you can see the laterals that are just busting. You saw the canes when I pruned them. There was nothing left. Well, look at this. They're full of buds. Will this be as full as it has been in years past? No, it will not be as full as it has been in years past because I cut it really hard. But that's not a bad thing to do every now and then, and I'm going to show you why in just a little bit. But basically, I've got these going in a nice horizontal position along my wires, and I can't be more pleased with the results that I'm already beginning to see. I want to take a little moment to show you how I tie these canes to this wire right here. Now, if I took this cane and tied it right to the wire like this, I have a danger of that cane rubbing up against that wire. I don't want that because that could potentially saw away and invite some damage. So let me just get this out of the way for a second. Let me show you what I'm going to do. All right, so I'm going to take this plant tie right here, just a basic plant tie. I'm going to wrap it twice around this wire, tight as I can possibly get it because I don't want it to slide. Then, watch, I'm going to take this, I'm going to start to twist it. Twist it, twist it, twist it, twist it. As you can see, I am now building a buffer between the wire and the actual twist tie where the cane is going to go. So now when I bring this cane in and I tie it, it's now separated by the wire no matter what happens. And that's nice and secure. That's not going anywhere. But again, I have that buffer between my wire and the cane, so this cane will never touch and rub against that wire. If you've seen my videos over the years or read some of my articles, you've seen my beloved Rev Door in my arbor. It was getting old, so I decided to take out an old cane. You might remember that from the beginning of the episode, knowing that this would spur new canes. And you know what? Guess what? Because here's the reveal. This has given me not only just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but I just noticed this morning back in here, a 6th new cane. That is right. I've got 6 new canes on this Rev Door by taking off an old one. When these come in and I can train them into mature, I'm going to take off another old one. And the cycle continues. That's why I don't really call it pruning. I call it rejuvenating. So Rev Door, welcome back. And if Rev Door wasn't enough, I just noticed this morning when I walked out to start filming. This is a wonderful old climber from Mike Athey out of New Zealand. And I took an old cane out of this one as well. And you will see here, folks, 1, 2, 3, 4, and over here, a 5th one, just beginning to merge. So again, on Rev Door, I got 1 for 6. On this one, I get 1 for 5. Not bad at all. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Everyday Rose Show. We learned about a new line of roses, met some echinacea. We took a rose off an arbor and red fence, repaired them both, put the rose back on again. We see how it's flourishing. And most of all, we learned what taking out an old cane can do for rejuvenating a rose. So if you enjoyed the show and you want to see more, please subscribe to my channel. That's easily done by the link at the end of this episode. But if you have questions, I suggest you go to my Facebook group, Paul Zimmerman Roses Gardening. It's marked private, but you can join. Just ask to join and we'll let you in. We've got over 60 countries represented, thousands of experts, lots of fun. It's a safe place for beginners and newbies in particular. No question too basic. No question will be answered too often. So please join us over there. And again, I hope to see you again on future episodes of the Everyday Rose Show. And in the meantime, till we meet again, happy rosing.